So we're here on Daf Sadi Gimel Amid Beis, and we started yesterday the sugya of Rav Sheshes. So let's just begin today's shir with a quick review of the suffix that was presented to Rav Sheshes. We're on Sadi Gimel Amid Beis, and we're up to Boyimine. I mean, this we did yesterday, but I just want to make sure we have the place. Yeah, Boyimine. So on the wide lines on Sadi Gimel Amid Beis, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 lines down in the wide line. And Balpeh, we're going to review the two tzadim in Rav Sheshes. The question here is called Masechet Yevamot. And the question is whether we believe the testimony of one single witness who testifies that she falls for Yibum. Which in effect has tremendous repercussions. Number one, it's Matu Isser Eshesach, the Erev of Eshesach. Number two, it generates an Isser of Yevamot Ashur. So do we rely on the testimony of one witness? And the whole suffix here in the Gemara revolves around the possibility of an analogy to what we learned at the beginning of the Perek Peiches in the case of Meis Bailef, where the Chachamim allowed a woman who is married to rely on the testimony of one witness and to marry another man when the witness testifies that her husband died. And the Rabbanan made that kula and accepted the testimony of one witness, even though the Torah always requires two witnesses, because we're going to rely on her, what we call daiko umitzvah. She's afraid of the repercussions that are very severe in event that her husband's still alive, so she's going to do her due diligence, her research, and conclude that her husband is for sure gone. So now the Gemara vacillates as to why we rely on one witness to allow her to marry when he testifies that her husband died. And there are two possibilities. And the difference between the two is going to be the case of Yibum that we want to address. One way of understanding it is that the thrust of the weight of the credibility of the aid is because of Milsa Davidi Ligluya, that a person would never lie and fabricate a story in Bezdin, in the courts, when we can just simply, the future will tell and will clarify whether he's lying or not. It doesn't pay to lie and put yourself into such a position in a Milsa Davidi Ligluya. And therefore, since it could be that the husband will come back alive and well, therefore the Eid Echad who testifies that he died would not lie in such a situation. If that be the case, then if you are giving credibility to Eid Echad because of Milsa Davidi Ligluya, we can apply it here in the case of Yavam as well, which means that when one witness testifies that she falls for Yibum, that's also called a Milsa Davidi Ligluya. And he writes here, in the future, we will be able to clarify. So therefore, we should accept and rely upon his testimony and allow her to fall for Yibum because of Milsa Davida Ligluya. That's one side. Now we have to add a little bit of a chidush here, meaning why is this side a chidush? And the answer is because efshar shemachmas chibas ha'isha liyavam eina mivareres heitev lifnei shemisyabemes. In other words, one could ostensibly argue that she has vested interest emotionally in the whole process of Yibum. It's a good thing for her to be able to have to consummate a marriage relationship with the Yavam. And therefore, she's not going to bother, how should I say, extending herself with a great deal of work and research and birur to investigate whether or not her husband died and she falls for Yibum to his brother. She would like to let the situation be alone, let it go on as it is. The aide is testifying that she falls for Yibum. That's great. She's happy with that. Nevertheless, we'll believe the Eid Echad even without adding the extra checking of her, the relying on her checking it out, which in this case, we don't really have reason to rely on her. But we'll rely on the witness because it's a miltzat davida l'gluya. We're going to find out in the future whether he's lying or not. Oh, Dilma, now the Gemara says, I'm going to offer you a different possible reason why the Chachamim rely on the testimony of one witness, and that's because Isha Daiku Mitzvah. It's not because we rely on the testimony of the aide alone. That certainly is worth, it kicks in, shall we say, 50% of the credibility here, but we also have another reason to believe that her husband died, and that's called Isha Daiku Mitzvah. Which means that she's afraid of all the repercussions, and therefore she'll certainly check out and convince herself after her research that her husband in fact died, and only then will she marry someone else. And that's what we're relying on. That's the other 50% of the credibility here to assume that her husband died. But in the case of Yibum, where she falls for Yibum, and we said before she may have very strong vested interest and emotional attachment to the Yibum situation, she wants to really be misyabemes to the Yavam, she's not going to do a daiko mitzvah, then we cannot rely on the testimony of one witness. So this was the question that was brought to the attention of Rav Sheshes. And his response was Tinisua, which is, I believe, where we stopped yesterday. So if you're counting up from the bottom of the Amud, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 lines up from the bottom, the first word of the line is Tinisua. And this is Rav Sheshes' response to the question that was presented to him. Let's read our Mishnah. Our second Mishnah, meaning not the Mishnah at the beginning of the parak, but our more recent Mishnah. Amrullah, they told this woman whose husband and son went out to a far-off land, Meis B'nech, V'achar kach Meis Bailech, which means that you fall for evil. When your husband died, he had no zerah. And Shimon married Ashes Reuben with Yibum, based on the evidence that was extant at the time. But then she finds out that the sequence was just the reverse, that her husband died first and her son, or his son, died second. And the Mishnah says, Ketzeh, she has to break up the relationship with her Yavam. And the reason for that is because the Yavam is not a Yavam at all. The Yivam is not a mitzvah of Yivam at all in light of the New Testimony. And therefore, there's an Erva and an Isur Kares between Shimon and Ashes Ruvain of Ashes Ak. And therefore, the marriage relation must be terminated. Vlad, what's the status of the child that she had from the Yavam? Rishon, the Achron, Mamzer. The child that she has from the Yavam is a Mamzer. And that is not whether she found out prior to her impregnation that there's no Yibum, meaning Chiluf Advarim, and in fact her husband died and then subsequently her son, his son died. Or she didn't know it, whether she knew about it or not, whether she had heard the information coming in from the Amrullah, the Achkach Amrullah, that's irrelevant. The child is a mamzer. He was born to an Isur Kares because there was never Yibum. So if Shesha says, let's analyze this mission. What exactly is the case that initially they let her marry the Yavam? If it's a case of Trey, there are two witnesses that testify that her son died first, and then subsequently her husband died. Utrey, and now there are two witnesses that testify to contradict the first two witnesses and tell us that the exact opposite is the truth, that her husband died first and then the son died. Is then I don't understand. My chazis, the samchas hahani, smocha hahani. Why do you tell me that we have to break up the marriage between her and the Yavam, and you're going to rely on the second pair of Eidim who testify that the husband died first? Samchas hahani. Why not choose to believe the first pair of Eidim? I don't know which pair of Eidim to believe. It's a toss-up. It's 2 against 2. It's what the Israelis call a teku. That's one of the few Israeli words that they got from the Talmud Bavli. Well, actually, there are more than a few, but this is one of the most popular ones, teku. We don't know who to believe. Go flip a coin. And now you're going to bust up the marriage to the Yavam just because of the second pair of Eidim? I want to believe the first pair of Eidim. Do me something. That's question number 1. And the old question number 2, Mamzer? How could the Mishnah call a child from the so-called Yavam a Mamzer? Maybe he is the Yavam. You want to call it a Safek Mamzer, that's fine, but don't call it a Mamzer. Maybe you'll tell me that the language of the Mishnah was not very meticulous. And when it says mamzer, it really means safek mamzer, and the Gemara and the Mishnah was relying on our best judgment to understand that mamzer here in this context means safek mamzer. That can't be. But midik tani seifa. Let's read the seifa, which is a case where they told her that her husband died, and then she went ahead and got married. And then she finds out that her husband is alive. And the Mishnah says, Havlad Rishon Mamzer Achron Eno Mamzer. Havlad Achron Eno Mamzer. Which means that if she had a child from another man before her husband died, that child is a mamzer. After her husband died, the child is not a mamzer. We see that the word mamzer in the Mishnah means mamzer vada. Therefore, by process of elimination, it cannot be that the testimony, the original testimony, was that of two witnesses to allow it to fall for evil, but rather it was only one witness. So the beginning was one witness, and we relied on that one witness, and we allowed her to fall for Yibum, and Yibum took place. Then two Adam came in and testified that her husband died first, son second, and she never fell for Yibum. We're going to accept the second pair of Adam because they are a full set of a cat of two Adam, and they are going to be believed to override and cancel any credibility of the first witness because he's only one witness, and Ein Dvarim Shel Echad B'Makom Shnayim is therefore Teitzei Min HaYavam. We believe the second pair of Adam that he died first, the husband, and now we understand that the Vlad from her relation with the Yavam is a mamzer because of Eishes Ach Shelo B'Makom Mitzvah. Oh, if that's the child in the Mishnah, now we have an answer to your question. Timer. The reason why the testimony of the first witness is rejected is the Asu Beitre, is because the first witness was contradicted by two witnesses. Akhshua, they have denied. I'll call it denied. They have denied the testimony of the first witness, and therefore that testimony is completely null and void. Halav hafi mehemun. No problem listening and relying to one aid. The only problem is that two witnesses came and contradicted that one aid. But had there been no contradiction, had the second pair of Adam not testified, if they didn't exist, then we would have relied on the testimony of one aid. It's a pretty brilliant analysis of the Mishnah. Ikoti Amri. Now the Gemara is going to present a second version, according to which the question that the Chachamim asked in the presence of Rav Sheshes had nothing to do with one witness testifying that a woman has to fall, testifying that she has to fall for evil. What did they ask? Oloti boilach. On that issue, we have no suffix. You're right. For sure, the Eid Echad is memon to testify. Yafilu ihi nami mehem. In truth, even if she herself testifies that her husband died and she has no children from her husband, her late husband, she falls for evil. Isnan. We have a Mishnah later on in the Masechet Yevamot. Ha'isha she'amra, a woman testifies in Bezdin, Mace Baili, my husband died, and we know that she has children. She's not skukal yavam tinase. She's allowed to get married based on her own testimony. And Mace Baili, in a case where there are no children, and she testifies that my husband died, tisyabit. How much more so would Eid Echad be believed to say that she falls for evil? I owe you one, because in the light of this statement of the Gemara, I don't know why Rav Sheshes had to make a whole deal to figure out that Eid Echad would be believed. Because l'chora, if she's believed, then certainly an Eid Echad is believed. So then what? If it's so simple that we rely on the testimony of one aid, Kedesha Tisyamin, so what was the suffix that was presented to Rav Sheshes? Elakiti Boilov, what was the suffix? L'mishrei Yevama li'alma. Just the opposite. We have one witness testifying to be matir the Yevama to get married to whoever she wants. For example, we know that her husband died without children, and therefore she falls for evil. Now, if somebody wants to marry this woman, and it's public knowledge that her husband died without leaving zera, then any potential suitor from the shuk is not allowed to go near this woman. She's Yevama Shuk. Comes along Eid Echad, and he says, you know what? The Yavam died. We know that her husband Ruvain died. We think that her husband's brother Shimon is alive. Comes along an aid and he says, I know that Shimon died. And now we allow, relying on this testimony of one aid, allow her to marry someone min hashuk. And that's called lemishrei Yevama li'alma. To be matir this Yevama to the Velt. I mean, this is exact opposite of what we've seen till now. Till now, the suffix was, can we rely on one aid to testify that our husband died without children, and therefore to be matir to eishes ach midin mitzvahs yibur. And now the Gemara is saying that that's simple. That's not, that there's no, how should I say, justification for having a suffix in that case. I mean, she herself is believed to say her husband died, and I fall for Yibum now to my late husband's brother. Certainly an Eid Echad would be believed, but rather the suffix was in the opposite direction. Not for the Eid Echad to testify that she should fall for Yibum because her husband died, but rather testimony that she doesn't have Yibum. When we assume she needs Yibum, we assume that the second brother, who called Shimon, survived, and therefore she has an afila for Yibum. And now the Eid Echad comes and testifies and says that I know that Shimon is dead, and therefore the Alma, she becomes Muteres. He writes, in the note here, he writes, Isha shahofa baila ubnala l'bina sayam, umeid Eid Echad shemeis bala tchila, That's one scenario that is in Suffolk. And the other is Isha Shiadua Shemes Bailable Bonim, Yeshla Lisyavim Liyovam, Umeid Ha'aid, meaning Eid Echad, Shemes Hayavam. And this suffix again is going to depend upon the reason why the Chacham believe Eid Echad, who testifies on an Ashes each that her husband died and is matir her to get married. If the time is because again, the Gemaras can actually spell it out, so I don't have to give you a preview. But basically, what the Gemara is vacillating about is whether the Iker Tam is we should compare two situations which are analogous. Eid Echad, who testifies that she doesn't fall for evil, and Eid Echad, who testifies that she does fall for evil. My time at Eid Echad, shall we say that the reason why the Chachamim rely on Eid Echad, who testifies that Meis Pilaf and allow her to get married, is Mishum de Milsa David Gluye Lo Meshaker, is Hachinami Lo Meshaker. Here too, when the Eid Echad testifies that Shimon, the Yavam, died, it's a Milsa David Gluye. Shimon can come in walking into Bezdin on 2 feet. O Dilma, or shall we say that Taima, the Eid Echad, why is an Eid Echad believed to say that her husband died and therefore she's allowed to get married? Is Mishum the E Daiku Mitzvah, but Hacha Lo Daiku Mitzvah. Here in this case, maybe she's not going to clarify that the Yavam died. Why? The Misna who disannulate, just the opposite of what we said before here on the top of Tzadi Dalid. She does not want to fall for evil. She finds the Yavam repulsive. She wants to get out of her tachtov, of Zikas Yibum. And perhaps this kind of situation is even more commonplace than a situation of the Yavama who he has the Chiba and desires to be married to the Yavam. And therefore we cannot compare these two cases in terms of Daiku Mitzvah, whether she'll clarify or not, because in one case, the issue is whether she'll clarify it because of her ava and her desire to fall for evil. In another case, the chash is that she won't clarify it because she doesn't want to be married to the other. Rav Sheshes Tnisua. Now Rav Sheshes is again going to derive a conclusion from our Mishnah. Amrullah, this woman whose husband and son went out to Medina Sayyam, Meis Bailech, V'achach Meis B'neich, which means that there was no Nefila for Yibum. In this case, and she married someone from the Shub, V'achach Amrullah Chiluf Hayud Dvarim, and first her son died and then her husband died, and therefore she fell for Yibum. Teitze, if she got married to someone from the Shuk, we bust up that marriage. Bavlad Rishon V'acham Mamse. And again, Rav Sheshes is going to analyze this. Hechi Domi. What's the case? In other words, let's go back to the first round when they were matir her. Ilema. if we're going to say that there were two Eidim who testified that your husband died first, and only subsequently your husband died, and she went ahead and she got married to someone at Shuk, the Achrechem, and afterwards, Trey, two witnesses came, and they turned it around. And they testified that it was the son who died first. And therefore you fall for Yibum and you're Yivam Lashuk. Is my chazis the samchas ahani smochahani? What proof do you have to rely on the second pair of Eidim, uli osra labaila, and break up her marriage to the Yavam? Smochahani, why not rely on the first two Eidim who say that the Baal died first? Again, let me go over this one more time. My chazis the samchas ahani. Why do you rely on the second pair of Eidim? Right, the chiluf advarim that testify that first the son died, and she therefore falls for Yibum. She's in Ramal Shuk Smochahani. Why are you going to bust up the marriage to this Shuk guy? Let's rely on the first pair of Eidim who say that her husband died first, and therefore she was not a Yavam Shuk. She never fell for Yibum. Yod, and furthermore, Mamzer, Sofik Mamzer. We have two pairs of Eidim that contradict each other. At best, you can call it a Sofik Mamzer. The Chitem Elodak, for Hamidik Tani Sefer, Rishon, Mamzer. The Achron, Eino Mamzer, Shmamino de Dafka Ktani. Elolav, we must conclude that Chad, there was only one witness who came in first, and we accepted his testimony that first the husband died and then the son, and therefore we allowed her to get married to someone in a shul. The second pair of Eidim came in. It's actually the first pair of Eidim because there was only one Eid. But the next two Eidim came in. They testified that the son died first, and then the husband died, which means that she falls for evil. Is therefore Teitze. We have to bust up the marriage with the man from the Shuk, because we believe the second pair of Eidim that Meis Bina Tchila, and she fell for Yibum. Now we can say that the Vlad is a Mamzer Vada. Says Rav Sheshes, now I can answer your question based on this Mishnah. Why? Because the reason why we rejected the first testimony is because it was only one witness that was contradicted by two witnesses. Because we don't accept the testimony of one, which is contradicted by two Eidim. Halav hachi. If the pair of Eidim had not come in to be machish the first Eid, we would believe the first Eid who testified that first her husband died, and then her son died, and she doesn't fall for evil. And we can be matter her to marry someone from the Shuk based on the testimony of one Eid. And if that be the case, in our question, the context of the question that was asked, raised to Rav Sheshes that she had a Yavam named Shimon, and now the Eid Echad is testifying that Shimon died, we can allow her to get married based on the testimony of one aide. Exactly like in our Mishnah, where the one aide testified that first her husband died and then her son died, and she doesn't require Yibum. Now the Gemara rejects Rav Sheshes Li'olam. We can interpret the Mishnah Trey, that the original Eidus was not one testimony, one witness, but it was two Eidim who testified that her husband died first, and then her son died, and then two Eidim came in and testified the exact opposite. And nevertheless, the second testimony is going to cancel and disqualify the first testimony. Why? Kida Omar Rav Acha Bar Meniomi B'Eidei Azama. It wasn't just that the second pair of Eidim testified that, in fact, it was the son who died first, but rather they testify about the first two pair of Eidim. You couldn't have been there to have seen what you claim you saw because you were with us in another place. And now in the Eidei Azama, the last pair of Eidim are believed when they testified that on that day which you, the first pair of Eidim, claim you saw the death of the husband and then the Ben died afterwards, you were with us in another place. You were in Chicago, you weren't in New York. And the Torah says we believe the second pair of Eidim. I know we ran out of time. I just want to add, Omnam he writes, B'nosaf l'kaf, gam hikchishu es ha'edim v'yomru. Not only did they say you couldn't have been there to see it because you were with us in a different part of the world, but they also testified that shemes habal v'aben mes, it was a ben shemes b'tchila v'achaf mes habal. And that's what the Mishnah says. It says chiluf hadvarim. So that even according to the second pair of Eidim, this woman is not an Ashes Ish. She requires Yibum. And when she gets married to someone with a Shuk B'Isur, they violated Isur Lav. And therefore we have to bust up that marriage. And the Vlad is a mamzer based on the Shita of Rabbi Akiva that ain't Kedushin Tofsin v'chai ve'lav. All right, so let's see where we got up to. And that is Amalei Rav Mordechai l'Rav Ashi. Here on Daf Sadi Dalet of an Alpha, approximately 12 lines down on the top.